Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 15th of November, 2019, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish, and we're delighted to be joined by David Scott. And of course, David giving us northern exposure from north of the border. Well, what better place to start than the European Union and Brexit?
And Paris. And well, here's Donald Tusk. Now, he speaking at the opening ceremony of the 2019-2020 academic year at the College of Europe. David, welcome to the programme. He had some interesting things to say in this speech. I mean, he's in demob mode because, of course, he's only got a few days left as president of the European Council. But the first little quote here is, "I didn't expect a few years ago when I was showing Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte this painting in Gdansk that within a year Europe would come to resemble some bits of the Last Judgment. If you remember the painting, you'll know exactly what I have in mind." What did he have in mind, David?
Well, this is a question because this is painted by Memling and it's quite striking. There's a panel which shows St. Peter leading the saved up to heaven, and there's a panel which shows the damned being cast into the pit of hell, and one in the middle where people are being weighed in the balance. Now, I'm not exactly sure which part of this he is referring to, but I suspect it may have been people being cast into hell, and that's a very interesting start for a demob happy speech.
Well, he went on then to highlight the three women that have had such a massive influence on his life: Hannah Arendt, Margaret Thatcher, and Hella Thorning-Schmidt.
Yeah, quite an interesting combination there. Hannah Arendt, also, a genuine, substantial intellectual who spoke so accurately about the nature of totalitarianism, and her great work on the Eichmann trial was called The Banality of Evil. Margaret Thatcher, yes, I don't know what your views of Margaret Thatcher. Mine, I think, are mixed, but he quotes that. So we've got at least a superficial free market liberty kind of approach that maybe doesn't go too deep. And then the third one was the Danish prime minister who was opposing him for his position and who stepped aside to let him win the presidency. So that was a political favor brokered by Van Rompuy, would you believe? So there we go. So we have deep political insight, superficial political insight, and political horse trading as his three women that he admires most.
Okay, so let's continue with it. It may sound banal, but when I'm asked what my team has been about, or what my term has been about, I answer without hesitation: unity, a leitmotif, a task, almost my obsession from the very beginning. And he went on to say, my message was in 2014, what Europe needs is protecting our fundamental values: solidarity, freedom, unity against threats to the EU and its unity, coming from both inside and outside. Politics has returned to Europe, history is back, and such times need leadership and political unity. I told you I was possessed with unity. And he said, I had to publicly remind others almost every week that Russia is not our strategic partner, but our strategic problem. I was even labelled a monomaniac for being so focused on the subject, but eventually it paid off. We maintained our unity, also in terms of sanctions, throughout my entire term. So that pretty much puts it into some context. He said,
Well, it's interesting. This at the start of that little portion, he starts off just after talking about Hannah Arendt, and of course her great work was The Banality of Evil. He then says it may sound banal, and I wonder if that's just a little bit of guilt, a little bit of realization, a sort of embedded confession there. And he then goes on to talk about unity. And of course, this, in European terms, makes you think of the fascists: unity from strength, from power from many being bound into one. This is what it's selling. Whenever you see someone selling unity, it's extremely dangerous. So he's certainly selling it hard.
Well, indeed, but let's consider what kind of unity he's actually talking about, because he towards the end of the speech, he started talking about Brexit, and he was very much regretting Brexit, that he did everything in his power to make sure that there was no deal scenario, and that there was an opportunity to extend the time for reflection, possible British change of heart, and so on. But we wanted to play out just a little bit of what he said, because frankly, people have been watching this program regularly over the last several weeks will probably have heard similar views from elsewhere, but we'll come on to that after we listen to this.
I have heard repeatedly from Brexiteers that they wanted to leave the European Union to make the United Kingdom global again, believing that only alone it can truly be great. You could hear in these voices a longing for the empire, but the reality is exactly the opposite. Only as part of a united Europe can the UK play a global role. Only together can we confront, without any complexes, the greatest powers of this world. In fact, I can say the same about Germany or France. And the world knows it. I have heard the same in India, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and South Africa, that after its departure, the UK will become an outsider, a second-rate player, while the main battlefield will be occupied by China, the United States, and the European Union. Why are they doing this? I was asked this regretful question everywhere I went. One of my English friends is probably right when he says with melancholy that Brexit is the real end of the British Empire.
So he doesn't have the Hitler-esque style of Guy Verhofstadt, David, but absolutely reflecting the same types of sentiment.
He is, but it's almost more telling than that than Verhofstadt, because Verhofstadt is just this sort of ideologue. But what we're getting here, firstly, he clearly lives in a bubble, because he's talking about Brexiteers. No, this is maybe Boris Johnson and maybe the Conservative Party, but the Brexiteers were not longing for empire. Liberty, yes. Empire, no. Maybe one of the things that brought Brexit about is that Britain had actually become quite comfortable with the fact that the empire was gone, and we were okay with that. That was a previous generation. It was nothing to do with us. So this is almost like, you know, a calumny, a lie that's been told by the Remainers about the Brexiteers. Oh, they just want empire back. So he's repeating that. But he then goes on to this using terms like battlefield, confronting the main powers. Yeah, confront the main powers. That's presumably China, USA, and maybe Russia. And talking about clearly the European Union as an empire and some sort of replacement for the British Empire, which it is manifestly not. So yeah, that tells us much about what's happening in this and the themes and wishes behind closed doors inside the EU and inside the bubble that controls the EU. That much more than it tells us about Brexit or Brexiteers.
Absolutely. Now he went on then to make this point. Now turning to the French president, one of the undisputed leaders of the European Union and our hope for the future, and my dear friend, I want to tell him that I share his dream for a truly sovereign Europe. And of course, what he's talking about is a truly sovereign EU, not a truly sovereign Europe as such. But of course, with that sovereignty, the requirement for that sovereignty is a defence, David.
Well, it's defence. It's further surrender of sovereignty by the individual states. It's further movement of sovereignty towards the centre, and it's to become an empire. It only makes that statement only makes sense in the context of a European empire, and he goes on to explain more about it. He says, "What is the point of unity, sovereignty, and solidarity?" Even that's a strange statement, because solidarity means unity. So what's the point of unity, sovereignty, and unity? So again, this unity theme keeps coming up. If we're unable to defend Europe, well, there we go. So the first thing that it goes to is defence. Understood as a territory of freedom, culture, and law against external and internal opponents. I think, Brian and Mike, that means you. if we are unable to defend Europe also against our weaknesses and misgivings, that means Brexit, against the temptation to make deals with evil, that means buying Russian oil, and against submission to the powerful and the ruthless, that means Trump. Europe is not a continent in a geographical sense, it's a continent in an axiological sense, and it will remain so as long as we have enough strength through unity, remember, to protect not only our borders and interests, but first and foremost, the essence of Europe. So this is a battle cry for war to defend the essence of Europe, which is, of course, only most loosely defined.
It's all becoming clear, though, isn't it? As more words come out of their mouths, as the desperation sets in, it's becoming clearer what's going on. I just wanted to add that if we've got anybody watching or listening from the United States, what you should be thinking about is this is Europe, the European Union, that regards the United States as an enemy. They want the military forces to help protect the EU empire. They want the body bags, but they don't want anything to do with the American people.
Absolutely, but as David has pointed out there, defence, a key part of this, and defence, not something that we're hearing about during this current general election here in the UK, except the Brexit Party have finally dealt with the issue. So this was an event which took place a couple of days ago, and Nigel Farage was asked about EU defence.
One of the other things that struck me being in the European Parliament is that we've been told for a long time, oh, there's no such thing as a European army, there's no way, they're never going to have it. I was there when they said we are going to have a European army. That will undermine NATO. It's not on, is it?
David, the remarkable thing about this whole debate is that because Boris put a figure on the side of a bus that was a bit on the high side, we're told we won the referendum through lying. They have been lying for 50 years. They told my parents it was about trade and cooperation and wouldn't affect our sovereignty, and so they voted yes in the 75 referendum, and they go on lying about the true nature of the European project. I had the opportunity to debate with Nick Clegg back in 2014, he of the genius fixed-term Parliaments Act and many other things, and it was really interesting. I said one of the reasons I don't want to be a member of the European Union is it's becoming a militarised union that will, I think, destroy NATO. And his response was, Nigel Farage is a dangerous fantasist for even suggesting there could ever be a European army. And as David said, it's full steam ahead now for a full European defence union by 2025. It will destroy our relationship with America, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. It has even more worrying implications for sharing information than it does for military cooperation. And I want to hear that we will take no part in it. Because if we take no part in it, it will not actually have any military or intelligence significance.
So, in fairness to Nigel Farage, that's probably the best statement I've heard from him ever on this issue. But again, it's in the safety of a Brexit Party event. So until the same type of language is brought to the BBC, for example,
and he's talking EU defence union.
Absolutely, yes. He has to start talking about this in the context of the general election on the broader media platform, rather than just at a Brexit Party event, which probably the only people that are going to watch what he had to say there are people that are Brexit Party supporters. This needs to be a much broader issue. David, briefly.
It is improving. He was kind of forced. He didn't volunteer to bring this up. Someone else raised it. And there's still this... it's okay, NATO, and NATO's the solution, when NATO's not the solution. NATO wants EU military union, and he's completely oblivious to that, it would seem. But nonetheless, still quite good.
I've got to smile wryly and say, I think you're being too generous. This man has not stood up on the public platform and talked about EU defence union in any detail. He's been pressed by senior military people who've said you need to talk about this. They've been hounded and silenced. He's not doing the job. That's my personal opinion, but let's run on and see what else he isn't doing. And we'll come to this because somebody kindly pointed out that Nigel had been tweeting, and what he tweeted was quite remarkable. He said, even Boris Johnson's chief strategic advisor, Sir Edward Lister, is calling our candidates and offering them jobs if they withdraw. The system is corrupt and broken. Hashtag change politics for good. Well, I was very intrigued on that. I did a little bit of research, and of course we find that this story has been out in the wider press for a few hours. Nigel Farage claims Downing Street insiders offered jobs to members of his senior team. And the man in question is this gentleman. These are the allegations pointed at this man, Edward Lister, Boris's Thatcherite. So he was former leader of Wandsworth Council, where he was known for, quotes, cruel spending cuts and covert demographic engineering. So he sounds an ideal man to be working with Boris. He'd stepped down as the chair of Homes England. But let's look in detail at what Farage had to say. He said, what we're seeing is the most incredible aggressive intimidation of our candidates. Brexit Party candidates were being subjected to Venezuelan-style intimidation by the Conservative Party in order to give Mr Johnson an easier path to number 10. And it went on where sources close to Mr Farage said he was considering reporting his allegations to police. Now, this is where this whole story gets very, very interesting, because if his allegations are true, this is a serious criminal offence under the Representation of the People Act 1983. And people might like to go and have a look at this themselves. The bit we're interested is at the bottom of your screen. And it's this: corrupt withdrawal from candidature. Any person who corruptly induces or procures any other person to withdraw from being a candidate at an election in consideration of any payment or promise of payment, and any person withdrawing in pursuance of the inducement or procurement shall be guilty of an illegal payment. So we're not talking in an idle accusation here being made against the Tory party. If true, what we're talking about is criminal offence. But this is where it gets interesting. We decided to speak to the Conservative Party this morning to get comment, because what we noticed was that in all the media stories, there wasn't actually a formal response on this matter from the Conservative Party. They said they would come back to me straight away. Well, of course they didn't, so their reply is silence. We also spoke to the Electoral Commission. They said they would respond, but we've had silence. But we do notice that on their own website, it says that the following allegations should be reported to the police: the behaviour or political finances of an individual candidate, non-party campaigners who campaign for or against a specific candidate, and the key one, the intimidation or harassment of candidates, campaigners, or holders of electoral office, whether in writing or in person. So this is a matter for the police. And David, I'm just going to throw it back to you here and say, if Nigel Farage knows this to be true and he does not take action and report it to the police, then he becomes complicit in the fact that we now have criminal activity in this election.
Yeah, it's also I understand offering people jobs, right? I've seen that done in other contexts in many cases where there's corruption. How do you nobble an opposing organisation? You offer key people jobs and inducements to pull them away. I've seen that done before. But then he then goes on and talks about harassment and threats. There's a lack of specifics about this as well, but it's quite clearly criminal. So if there's any evidence, it has to go to the police.
It has to go to the police. So we're going to put this up on screen because it's only going to go to the police if the public stand up and ask for something to happen. Nigel Farage has pushed this out in the public domain. It's in writing. It's there on his Twitter feed. It's reported in the press. And the law clearly says that if true, this is criminal activity. So we're going to say today this is a matter for the public to pick up and to ask for the Met Police to do something. We'll wait and see what happens.
Okay, now if you like what the UK Column's doing and you would like to support us, then please head over to ukcolumn.org/community, where there are ways to support us there, and your support is much needed and much appreciated. Sticking with elections to a certain degree, let's move on to this. The Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament. Now, in March, they finalised a report which they called Russia, and on the 17th of October, they sent it to Boris Johnson for review, for rubber stamping, and after that it was supposed to be made public, but it has not been made public. The report delayed, apparently, Boris's excuse is standard security clearance reasons, well, his delaying of it has received criticism from the chair of the committee. He apparently, according to various allegations, doesn't want this report coming out until after the general election. So the committee took evidence from independent experts, from members of the intelligence agencies, MI5, MI6 and GCHQ. They also took evidence from Bill Browder, of course, Magnitsky Act fame, and they also took evidence from Christopher Steele, who of course is the man behind the dodgy dossier for the Trump-Russiagate scandal. And another person that they took evidence from is Edward Lucas of Integrity Initiative fame, and currently working with the Exposed Network. This is the next generation, perhaps, of Integrity Initiative type operations. And then last week, Hillary Clinton was in the UK to promote her book. Well, lo and behold, wasn't she on the BBC?
I'm dumbfounded that this government won't release the report about Russian influence, because every person who votes in this country deserves to see that report before your election happens.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, but that seems like election interference by a politician from a foreign country.
Can we call her a politician? Is that what she is?
Well, it's quite possible. She's apparently under lots of pressure to stand again in the election next year. But
a joke, a dangerous joke.
Absolutely. So what's Boris saying about this? He said there's no evidence for Russian election interference, and I think we've got to be very careful before we simply cast aspersions on everyone who comes from a certain country just because of their nationality. And of course, a lot of the driver behind this is the fact, as we've highlighted on this programme, that the Conservative Party has received many donations from certain Russians. But of course, what nobody mentions, in the mainstream at least, is that those certain Russians that are funding the Conservative Party are not pro-Putin Russians necessarily, in fact, not at all. But nonetheless, it goes on because the Bureau of Investigative Journalism has mounted a legal challenge for the release of this Russian interference report, as they're calling it. They are looking for money for this, and they've written to Boris Johnson demanding the publication of the Intelligence and Security Committee's report. And they say that if he fails to release it, lawyers have been instructed to challenge the decision by way of an immediate application or an urgent application for a judicial review. The contents of the 50-page report, they say, are believed to detail possible efforts by Russia to subvert British elections and interfere in UK politics, including an examination of the closeness of oligarchs to the Conservative Party. Several of the known ties between Conservative Party and wealthy Russian donors were first exposed, they say, by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. And they say that the ISC's report, prepared by a cross-party group of MPs, has been cleared for publication by the security services, passed to number 10 for final sign-off, but against public wishes of several committee members has been withheld until after the election. David, where do we go with this? This is clearly, it seems to me, a cynical attempt to bring Russia into this, make Russia an election issue in this election. I don't believe for 1 second Russia has interfered in either this election, the 2017 election, or the 2016 EU referendum, but that's the allegation. And somehow Russian oligarchs, which have left Russia because Putin doesn't like them very much and are funding the Tory party, seem to be to blame for all this?
Well, you see, Mike, you got to understand what the nasty, cynical Russians are doing here, because they've got themselves a TV channel, and they put people on this TV channel, and they say, "Would you like to speak on the TV channel?" And the people say yes, and they say, "Well, we'll phone you at 3:30. You're on at 3:45," and they let the people speak. And this is not the BBC way of doing things. This is completely uncontrolled. This is unregulated information. This is defined as interference, because what's defined as correct is complete control of all the means of communicating with the public and of the message. So the Russians, in a funny way, they are interfering, but they're interfering in a way that we should be somewhat thankful for, because at least they're not the BBC.
Absolutely. Isn't it ironic that the ISC, the committee, went to the same so-called expert sources for this particular report as the United States, Hillary Clinton, in fact, did for the original Russiagate report?
It's an example of lack of learning curve, because it's just the same themes that failed to keep Trump out have been marshaled against Brexit. No, this time it'll work. And it's the same, and it fails. And well, next time it'll work. Let's try it again. Let's have Hillary Clinton as a candidate. I mean, really, you can't come up with another idea.
Well, I need to rub this in. So if we just have a look at this Sun report here, just take a bit of it. Boris Johnson said he'd absolutely nothing to hide over the unpublished report into alleged Russian meddling in British politics. Told BBC 5 Live today, "I see absolutely no reason to change normal proceedings for publishing ISC reports just because there's an election. They're not normally published at that pace." He didn't want to really talk about Russian oligarchs, but what he did say, and it's very not often I agree with Boris Johnson, right at the end you can see he said it's all there in the public domain. And the problem is that this is correct, because if we go back to his relationship with the Russian Alexander Temerko, what can we show you? Well, just remind you that in this Reuters report, it said that basically Boris Johnson used to get together with Mr. Temerko, and they used to plot in Westminster over a glass of wine. That's the first thing we should remember. And then in a February 2019 conversation, Temerko forecast that if Brexit isn't implemented, the time of the mainstream parties will end, the old system will be destroyed, and his old friend Johnson, could lead a new movement backing Brexit. This is an extraordinary coincidence. So we've got the oligarchs that many of them booted out of Russia for being involved in all sorts of dirty dealing. They slip over to London, they start to fund the Conservative Party, and then they can predict the future unbelievably accurately. David, these are some incredible individuals. I think we'd like to know more about them and their relationships with the Tory party. Before I let you reply, just remind viewers that it is in plain sight, because these are some of the reports talking about the amount of Russian money coming into the Conservatives. So we've got the Independent, 100,000, it's talking about 100,000 into the Conservatives from former Putin ally's wife. We've got Boris enjoying parties with Lebedev and the Lebedev mention. And on the right, we've got Telegraph, Tories will not return a mere 820,000 that's come from so-called Russian sources. Bottom left, of course, we need to point out that Labour was up to their what's it's in it as well. So,
but that first headline, well crafted, because of course they say former Putin ally's wife. If people read that carelessly, they see that it's a Putin ally.
Yes.
But a former Putin ally could very well be someone, and probably is someone, who was chucked out of the country for corruption.
Yeah, and of course many people don't pick up on this, that what Putin did was to clear out of Russia people who were involved in all sorts of massive wheeling and dealing and criminal activity, and many of them simply moved over to Russia and
to London.
Moved over to London. and then we had that Russian involvement in British politics. It's very complicated, David.
It is. But the use of people like Christopher Steele to give evidence about this suggests to me that there's some deep state involvement here that's looking to tar the Russian regime in a way which is not supported by the evidence. And I think if we're going to have an investigation, I would rather have I'd rather have one that takes evidence about Christopher Steele, not from him.
Absolutely. Okay, just briefly, tomorrow at 9 p.m, the BBC is calling this a world exclusive. A BBC Newsnight interview recorded yesterday at Buckingham Palace, and this is Emily Maitlis, is going to be talking to Prince Andrew about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. This is the first time he's answered questions on the scandal, they claim. The Guardian then reported that Newsnight sources had said the interview was the result of 6 months of negotiations with the royal household, with an agreement that there would not be any advanced vetting of the questions. Now, of course, they don't say who would be vetting the questions. So Brian was demonstrating a little bit of skepticism in our discussions earlier about this. And the question is this because the questions came from Buckingham Palace in the first place, so there was no need for Buckingham Palace to vet them? It's not really clear. So that is on tomorrow. David, are you confident that the BBC will get to the bottom of this situation?
No, because the BBC don't even have the start. Well, the BBC have a serious problem with covering up issues like this, and the BBC don't have a starting point that allows them to even address the issue. I personally feel they are too corrupt themselves to be asking these questions.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on then to this. Now, earlier in the week, we were talking about the Society of Editors conference, which was taking place in London, and one of the things that they were discussing was online harms and the online harms white paper, which of course was published earlier in the year by the Conservative government of the time. And which, of course, is going to have a chilling effect on free speech on the internet. So the meeting at the Society of Editors discussion was chaired by the Chief Executive of Index and Censorship. And I'll just run through a couple of things, a couple of the comments that people made on this. This is John Whittingdale, of course, Tory MP, saying news organisations need to create a reputation for reliability. And of course, this is goes hand in hand with the online harms white paper in the sense that many of the so-called fact-checking organisations are really pushing this idea of reputation and reliability, and they're creating plugins for web browsers so that you can automatically know whether a news source that you go to is reliable and reputable and so on. He said that we always need to bear in mind freedom of expression, and sometimes that means saying that these things we don't like, saying things we don't like, but some of the things proposed to counter them are more harmful. Well, that is fair enough and correct. Then we had John Battle, head of compliance at ITN, saying, I think we'll look back on these times and think we cannot believe what was allowed to go on in 2019. Well, of course, the things that are being allowed to go on in 2019 are the shutdown of free speech, and so we can agree with that as well. Well, here is Elizabeth Denham, the Information Commissioner. She was on the platform as well, saying this is a very, very, very tricky area because what the white paper is discussing and what parliamentarians are discussing is putting constraints over material which is not illegal but is offensive. So just as a reminder, just so that everybody understands what the online harms white paper was all about, I'm just going to run through some of the harm, because of course online harm was not defined in the white paper. They give examples of what they considered to be harms, but they didn't define it as a term. They said that the white paper was going to deal with child sexual exploitation and abuse online. It seems to me that there are already laws in place to deal with child sexual exploitation and abuse, and so there's no particular need for that to become a focus of this particular thing. Terrorist content online, it seems to me that there are probably laws in place to deal with that already as well. content illegally uploaded from prisons. Indeed, take smartphones from prisoners if you're worried about that, or don't give them access to Wi-Fi if you're worried about that. The sale of opioids online, this also seems to be something that is already illegal. Cyberbullying, well, there's already ways to deal with this problem as well. Self-harm and suicide. Again, this is not really an online problem. This is something that is societal, and perhaps you want to deal with the underlying problem that causes people to self-harm and commit suicide rather than worrying about what's online there. Underage sharing of sexual imagery. Again, this isn't necessarily an online problem either. This is perhaps a parental problem or a problem in the schools. But now we come to the real issues that they are concerned about, and perhaps the issues that Elizabeth Denham was referring to there. Online disinformation, online manipulation, and online abuse of public figures. These, I think, are the key areas that are for being dealt with here. And we've got to remember there's a general election going on at the moment. This particular issue has not been forgotten, and it is going to be front and centre of any Queen's speech that may happen in January. And it's something that we, David, should be absolutely concerned about and keep at the forefront of our minds. It's good that these people were discussing it, but I'm not entirely certain that the mainstream press or their representatives quite grasp the full extent of this.
There is it's always dangerous when you see things that are universally or virtually universally opposed by people like terrorism and harming children, being then lumped in. So we'll have one act. We'll stop this, and by the way, we'll stop criticizing politicians. What? How are these things in any way related? If you look at the cartoons that were put out in the 18th, 19th century in this country, they were horrendously pointed at politicians, and that was okay. In fact, that was quite healthy. In fact, I think the country kind of did quite well back then. And I'm seeing within the political elite a tendency to want to hide from any criticism. And Hamza Yusuf will talk about in a minute. I witnessed him round on a member of the public in a public meeting hosted by the BBC because the member of the public referred to Nicola Sturgeon as Mrs. Murrell, her married name, and he described how disrespectful this was and how we must respect our presumably betters. No, Hamza, that's not true. That's not what we do in this country. A bit of healthy contempt for those who claim the right to rule us is a guarantor of liberty.
Absolutely.
Well, just to add to that, we may be protecting children from online harm or not, but the BBC is certainly not going to protect children from the dangers of vaccines. So we had this headline. Now, this was pointed out to me by a fully qualified medical doctor. The headline, severe allergic reactions rise in children in England over the past 5 years. What was his comment? Well, what you need to look for is that the young girl died from sesame allergy. And what is the significance of this? Well, I was forwarded this report, which people can find easily online if you search for it, but it's the result of a study into the fact that severe allergies have really started an increase since vaccinations have really got underway. And what it says is that many vaccine ingredients are protected by trade secret and are not listed. And then some manufacturers rely more predominantly on oils than in other vaccines. Sesame oil in the vaccines is used in Israel and parts of Europe. So in a story that the BBC doesn't cover properly, the experts who know what they're talking about can quickly point out what the problem is. And if you get hold of this report and look, it's talking about all sorts of allergies that are coming up, including soy allergy, which is directly connected to the use of components of soy and aluminium in the vaccines. And the one we've just mentioned about the sesame oil is used in Israel. So BBC not telling the truth, not warning, and of course parents at the moment are being lured into vaccinating their children without understanding the risks of those vaccines.
David, a second ago you mentioned Humza Yousaf. What's been going on here with respect to Sheikh Obeyo's case? And just a very brief reminder of Sheikh Obeyo's case.
Yeah, Sheikh Obeyo was killed when he was arrested by police in 2015. He was behaving strangely. He seemed to be under the influence of something. The police were called. A very large number of police arrived. Sheikh Obeyo was very quickly prone on the floor, with many policemen on top of him, and a great amount of things like pepper spray was used, and he was shackled. And 90 minutes later, he was pronounced dead. What then followed was a very concerning refusal by the police to engage properly with their own investigation into what happened, and a long fight, so far unsuccessful, by his family and friends for some form of justice. So this fight is going on. And here we see an announcement by Humza Yousaf, who is the Justice Secretary, the other day in Holyrood. He said, following what has been a complex and thorough investigation and review, we know these words so well, the Lord Advocate has confirmed that on the basis of the evidence available, there will be no criminal proceedings against Police Scotland or individual police officers in connection with Mr. Obeyo's death. So there's nothing to see here, says the Lord Advocate. Nothing to bring to court. Move along. We have here a reaction from Common Space, online left-leaning paper within Scotland, and they're quoting the family here. Why should police officers be above the law? And this is the question we're all asking. This is the question we're asking in Caithness as well. And they describe the events there. I'll just briefly run through what they say. He was stopped by police in Kirkcaldy on the 3rd of May 2015. He was subsequently held face down within 46 seconds of the first two officers arriving. During his restraint, officers used baton, CS gas, pepper spray, handcuffs, leg and ankle restraints. Post-mortem found that he suffered 23 injuries, including head wounds, a fractured rib, facial injuries, bruises to his body, peritoneal hemorrhages, and approximately an hour and a half after his restraint, he was pronounced dead. So that's the thing that we're concerned about. It's a genuine concern. It's an appalling case, and it's been, as far as criminal charges, there will be none. So Humza went on, responding to calls by the family. He says, today I confirmed that I will establish a statutory public inquiry under the Inquiries Act 2005 into the circumstances leading up to and following Mr. Obeyo's death. And he goes on in detail, indeed all deaths in police custody are subject to mandatory fatal accident inquiry under the Fatal Accident and Sudden Deaths, etc. Scotland Act 2016. The responsibility for establishing the FAI sits with the Procurator Fiscal under the direction of the Lord Advocate. Everything in Scotland is controlled by the Lord Advocate. FAIs examine the cause of death and could have steps to prevent other deaths in similar circumstances. In this case, however, the Lord Advocate, as head of the system of investigation of deaths in Scotland, considers the remit of an FAI would not allow the issues which require to be investigated to be addressed, which is correct. FAI can examine circumstances and factors leading up to a death, but not what follows after. And in this case, the Lord Advocate has identified questions raising issues of public interest and importance about the early stages of the post-incident management of the investigation that an FAI simply could not examine. This being the case, it is imperative the circumstances leading up to Mr. Obeyo's death and events that followed are examined in full and in public. Well, let us hope so. Let us hope that the presence and role of Peter Black-Watson, who was there and who was a lawyer for the Scottish Police Federation and for many newspapers and for TV stations and for senior politicians, let's hope that that situation will be included in the full and public inquiry.
I'm astonished, but I'm not. What we've got here is a decision has been made that the police weren't guilty of any criminal actions, But you then admit that you don't actually know what really happened, and we need an investigation to establish what happened. Is that roughly correct?
Well, yes, and I mean, what have we learned so far? We've learned that the lawyer representing the family is an intelligence file held on him by Police Scotland. We haven't learned very much in the public domain about what actually happened to Sheikh O'Bail, and we certainly haven't got enough information about the nature of the investigation that then swung into place.
Yeah, extraordinary. I think we're out of time.
We are.
David, we're going to say thank you very much for joining us. The news becomes ever more incredible as we see the pantomime and deceit of British politics unfold. I'm not sure what to think for the weekend. Presumably that the good Russians are working with Boris Johnson to fund the Conservative Party to help us come out of Europe so they don't fight the Russians. Is that roughly correct?
Possibly.
We'll leave people to think about that. Thank you for joining us. If you're not already a subscriber to UK Column, please consider taking out a subscription. We can only do what we do with your help. We look forward to seeing you same time on Monday. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.